Today's daf we're going to be learning is Yoma daf Nun Vav. This week's learning is sponsored by Robert and Paula Cohen in memory of Paula's father, happens to be my grandfather, Chaim Avram ben Alter Gershon HaKohen. And this week's learning is also sponsored by Alana Storch in honor of the birth of her granddaughter, Re'ut Noah, born to her children, Juliana and Reuben Habusha Cohen. Re'ut Noah is named for women of strength and courage. One day she will know that a week of learning was dedicated to her arrival, and I will share the great achievements of Rabbanit Farber in the beautiful community of Hadran. Mazal tov. Okay, since we have a very short daf, I will, and also it's kind of connected to yesterday's daf, I'll do a little bit of review of where we were yesterday, and that will get us started on today. There's also a sheet. I didn't manage to prepare a sheet for Shabbat, but for yesterday's daf, but I started with the middle of yesterday's daf on today's sheet. So it's a good review. We had in the Mishnah a machloket, Rabbi Yehuda and the rabbis, or Tanakama, about this pedestal or stand that was in the Hechal, where they would put the blood. Was there one pedestal only, according to Rabbi Yehuda, or two pedestals, according to the rabbis? One for the par, one for the seir. Remember, it's very important, the order, how you bring the blood. First, always the par, then the seir, right? First the bull, then the goat. And then and then bringing them inside to Kodesh Kodeshim, and then the same thing outside Kodesh Kodeshim when they're in the Hechal. The Kohen, he is in the Hechal when the Kohen Gadol. Again, first he takes the blood from the par, then the bull. The bull, then the par, which is the bull, and then the goat. Only at the end does he mix them together, but at the beginning they all have to be separate. So according to Rabbi Yehuda, we can use only one pedestal, and we'll see why. So first, the Gemara brought a Mishnah from Masechet Shkalim, where Rabbi Yehuda said, when we came to the 13 shofarot in the temple, which were like the tzedakah boxes, so to speak, where people would put money in for all sorts of things they needed for the temple. It wasn't for tzedakah, but it was for all sorts of things needed to be brought in the temple. He said there weren't, like Tanakama says, one for bird. The bird offerings included both the obligatory ones, which included Ola and Chatat, sin offering and burnt offering. And it was also for voluntary offerings. Rabbi Yehuda said, no, that's not the split between the two is not obligatory and voluntary. The split between the two is which type of bird, but they're all only voluntary offerings. And the reason given first was it's because we're worried you're going to confuse the two. Why would you confuse the two if you could write on them? Right. Okay, this is for chovah, and this is for nidava, this is obligatory, this is voluntary. To which we said, Rabbi Yehuda clearly holds that people aren't going to read what you write. You can't rely on the fact that they're going to read. Because of that, we're worried there's going to be confusion, either on the part of the people putting the money in, or maybe on the part of the Kohanim taking the money out and spending the money on the bird offerings. Either which way, someone's not going to read it, and we're going to have a problem. So, to which they said, oh, perfect proof for this. We can strengthen this answer by using our Mishnah. It must be the reason why he had only one pedestal, because we're worried the Kohen Gadol might not pay attention and might confuse the blood of the bull and the goat. And because of that, even though you could write on one bull and on one goat, one par, one seir, we're worried the Kohen Gadol might not pay attention. To which the Gemara said, but wait a minute, that's not the reason when it comes to the shkalim and the shofarot, because when it comes in that situation, we saw that Rabbi Yehuda in the Mishnah says you put labels on each of the shofarot. So that's not his issue, because he obviously thinks that people can read, and we can rely on the fact they can read because he puts a name on each one. So that's not his reason, to which the Gemara says it must be a reason. First they bring one, then they modify it a little. So I'll read it according to the conclusion, which is we're concerned at what? We're concerned that somebody might put money in, if you allow it used in that way for the sin offering, and they might, if it happens that they die, it's not that we're worried maybe they'll die, but if they actually die before the Kohen Gadol took the money and spent it on the bird offering, we're going to have money mixed in here, which is not allowed to be used to buy offerings, because the only thing you could do with a chatat, sin offering, that the owners have died, is to leave it to die. If it was an animal, in this case, it's just money, has to be thrown into the water and destroyed. So therefore, that's his reason, and not because we're worried about writing. To which the Gemara questioned, but wait a minute. I don't see why can't Rabbi Yehuda just say if someone were to die, we take out the value of whatever that one bird offering was going to be, take that money, throw it into the water, and leave the rest of it, right? And that will be what we call retroactive designation, brera. It will be predetermined, even though it wasn't necessarily, we won't be able to find the exact money they put in because the money's not labeled and we don't know which money, all money looks the same. But if we take out that exact value, we can say now it's as if that was what was designated to the Chatan. We've sent it to be destroyed. Everything else now is totally fine and freed up. To which the Gemara answers, must be Rabbi Yehuda doesn't hold brera. And that all comes to explain, which is the conclusion here, even though we're not going to finish yet. But the reason in Shkalim why Rabbi Yehuda disagrees with the rabbis and doesn't allow any obligatory offerings is because in the event that someone were to die, there's no resolution because he doesn't hold by brera. If he held by brera, there would be a good solution. But he obviously doesn't hold by brera, to which the Gemara says, how do we know? And that's what we're going to start today. So Rabbi Yehuda, we'll start a few lines from the bottom of Nun Ham a bit. Rabbi Yehuda late brera, he doesn't hold by brera. Min nalan, from where do we know this? The structure is going to be as such. We're going to see ilema. Ilema always means if you are to say, and that will be rejected, in which case they come up with a different answer. So we're going to suggest one source, which we've seen enough, which comes up in Shas many times. It's one source because it's always the basic source for brera, although we're going to see it's not exactly. And then we're going, and as it is about brera, but the machloket in here really isn't about brera, which is what they think originally. They're going to reject that, and then they're going to explain it's from a different source. And it's something that we learned in Eruvin already. So if you learned Eruvin, you'll hopefully remember this sugya, and if not, it'll be good review. This is what I always say, that when you learn through Daf Yomi, you often get to sugyot that repeat and repeat and repeat, and therefore, eventually you get them down pat. So the Gemara says, if you want to learn it from the following Mishnah, Halokech yain mi beina kutiim erev Shabbat im chashecha. If you purchase wine just before it gets dark on erev Shabbat, and you purchase it from kutim. Okay, kutim we've talked about a number of times. They're also called shomronim. It's the people who were put into Shomron when the Assyrians had the whole. They exiled the Jews from Shomron. The whole kingdom of Israel was before the Babylonians came and destroyed the first temple. First, they took away all the Assyrians came and took away all the Jews living in Shomron and that whole kingdom of the north. And he removed them, put different people in their place. The people who came to live there were known as the Shomronim because they lived in Shomron, and they started dying by all these lions were killing them, and they realized we must not be keeping the laws of the land. They found a Kohen who could teach them the laws. He taught them how to be Jews, and they became Jews. There's a big debate about them. Are they just Gerei Harayot? They just converted out of fear and they're not really true converts? Or are they Gerei Emet? Are they real true converts? Either which way we look at them, though, there's certain things that they weren't careful about keeping, and one of them was Trumot Masal. So you buy from them, you can assume whether it's Gerei Emet or Gerei Harayot, we're not going to get into that, but they didn't keep laws of Trumot Masal. So you buy from them, and they didn't tithe their produce. So now what do? If it's produce like fruits and vegetables and things like that, you have enough time before Shabbat just to separate some and put them aside. However, in this case, you bought a flask full of wine and you don't have an empty flask to separate the wine and say, hey, I'm separating this from my Trumot Masal. Now, the presumption is you probably bought this because you needed wine for Shabbat. So now what do? Do you have a way to fix the situation and drink the wine on Shabbat? If you remember, you're not allowed to separate Trumot Masal on Shabbat. So he buys this with, let's say, just enough time to do the Trumot Masal, but he has nothing to put it into. So what does he do? Omer va'omer, he stands up and he says, he makes a declaration here. Shnei lugin she'ani atid lahafrish harei hein truma. We're now going to have we're going to count exactly how much he has to take. Let's say it's 100 log. That's the example here. He has 100 log. Log is a volume measurement. 100 log of wine. He says, listen, I'm going to start drinking, but I'm going to make sure to leave over in the bottom of this flask. Ultimately, I'm going to leave over how much? So he says, 2 log of what I'm leaving over, which is 1/50th of the amount, 2 out of 100, 1/50th, is going to be for Truma, because that's the average for Truma. Remember, Truma Gedola that you give to the Kohen can be either 1/40th, 1/50th, 1/60th, depending on your generosity. So he says, this is just an example, 1/50th, that's the average, will go to the Kohen. Asara ma'aser rishon. Now the ma'aser rishon goes to the Levi. He says 10 more log, which is really not 10, it's really 9.8, because it's a tenth of what's left. He's left with 98. So it's 9.8. There's another case of where the Mishnah or Gemara doesn't, it's the Mishnah here, but they don't get into decimals. I've seen this many times. They talk around numbers. So it's really 9.8, but we'll stick with what they say. 10 will be Ma'aser Rishon. Tish'a Ma'aser Sheni. Now, whatever's left, you take a tenth of what's left. So there's 88 left. It should now be 8.8, which they call 9. 9 more log will be Ma'aser Sheni. Umechal v'shotem miyad. And then he redeems the Ma'aser Sheni onto something because that can be redeemed. And he drinks immediately. In other words, right now, he basically is drinking. Now, what happens when he drinks? You can't say whatever is at the bottom of the flask, because as soon as you start drinking, everything gets mixed up. It's not like fruits and vegetables that you can really separate and keep them aside. Here, he's got no way to do that. So what does he do? He just says, listen, in the end, whatever I will be left with, as long as I leave over this amount, which is the 2 log plus the 9, right, plus the 10 plus the 9. Really, the 9 he can already redeem on something else, but whatever, let's just say. So as long as he leaves over at the bottom when Shabbat's over and he gets to where he gets to, and he basically, says, okay, I'm now going to take this and I'm going to give this to the Kohen, that to the Levi, and great, it's perfect. Okay, and then obviously the Ma'aser Sheni that he has to bring to Yerushalayim. Okay, but now he can drink immediately now. Okay, no problem. This works. Divrei Rabbi Meir. Now, this is what we call retroactive designation, because there's no way to separate that Trumot Masrot now. And in the end, he could be drinking part of the Trumot Masrot, because let's say he says the bottom part. The bottom part is now going to be at the top when he goes to drink, and he might drink it. So the point is that we don't care. In the end, he's basically allowed to drink this. And in the end, it'll be designated retroactively from the beginning. Otherwise, he'll be drinking teva, what we call, which is untithed produce, or he's drinking the maaser or the truma, even worse. Right? You're not allowed to drink truma. For sure, you're not allowed to do that, right? We know only the Kohen can drink truma. So basically, what we're assuming is that once in the end he comes and it's left at the end, we can say that retroactively that was the one that was designated from the beginning. This is just like the chatat shemetu ba'ala. We take out the money and we say, right now we're determining that from the beginning, this was the money that woman put in or that man put in, even though we have no idea really what money they put in, but that works. As long as we designate something later, we can say that was as if it was done retroactively. Rabbi Yehuda, now this is important. What are we trying to find? Rabbi Yehuda is the one who says, Ein Brera. That's what we're trying to prove. So here it's perfect, because Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Shimon, Oslim, Alma Ein Brera. They say you can't do this. Must be because they don't hold by Brera, in which case we have our answer. But if you remember, I told you that this is an ilema. Ilema means if you say this, it's going to be rejected. Why is it going to be rejected? Well, this is a good example of quoting something out of context. Mimai, Dilma shanehatam kedikatani tama. Who's to say the reason here is Brera? There, the reason is given why they say it's forbidden. So now we're going to explain the reason why Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon and Rabbi Yossi forbid, and it happens not to be because they don't hold Brera, it's for a different reason. Kedikatani tama, as it says there, the reason. In the Mishnah it says, Amrulo le Rabbi Meir. They said to Rabbi Meir, Iya tamodeh shema yibaka hanod v'nimtza shotet tfalim lemafreya. They say to him, Rabbi Meir, how can you allow this? Even if we were to agree, yesh brera, that you could do this, there's a separate problem, right? They're not dealing with the brera issue. We don't know what they hold on that. But there's a separate problem here. What's the problem? You're drinking from this flask. What if the flask breaks over Shabbat? So you drank stuff that you said, I took Trumot Masrot. But when are the Trumot Masrot going to be effective? When you're left with the amount that you're supposed to give, and then you give it to the Kohen. So, or when you separate it from, let's say you get to some place eventually where you have another flask. So you pour it into that flask, then it will be as if you separate the Trumot Masrot from now. But what if it breaks before you get to do that, right? This is called the warrior attitude, right? The what if people. They say to Rabbi Meir, what if it breaks? If it breaks, what happens? You'll never separate those Trumot Masrot because the wine is going to spill on the ground. It's not like oranges or lemons or something like that, where so what if something broke and they're still there and intact, but this wine will be absorbed into the ground. You'll never be able to pick it up. And right, it sounds a little like the blood that spilled, but somehow they thought you could pick it up. If the blood spills, remember after it was already in the kli, it was okay. But here, you're never going to be able to pick up this wine. You'll never be able to give it to the Kohen or the Levi. So in the end, if it breaks, again, if this is like maybe someone will die once they give their money, right? It's the kind of same attitude. If it breaks, you'll never end up taking the Truma Maslot. And in the end, it will retroactively be determined that, forget retroactive determination, what we were looking for, it'll be retroactively determined that you ate tevel, you drank food that you hadn't taken Truma Maslot. So that's why they think this is a problem, but not because they hold ein breira. Breira should work theoretically. It's just that in the event that it were to crack, which is, again, what's the chances? I don't know. It's if you're traveling, which it seems like you are, otherwise you maybe would have some utensil to put it into, some other flask. So if you're on the road, that happens very often, things break. And what does Rabbi Meir answer? Tamar lahem, if it breaks, we'll deal with it then. I'm not worried about that chance. Okay, this is a classic argument about, right? How worried are you about things, right? This is, I know, very common in the COVID pandemic, right? There's some, in families especially, right? There's one spouse who's super concerned and worried, and there's one who's got the attitude, oh, don't worry about it. I'll deal with it when it happens. And right, we know this from many areas in life, that there's worriers and there's not worriers. And Rabbi Meir says, I'm not worried about it. If it happens, I'll deal with it when it happens, but I'm not going to worry about it now. I'm not going to stop someone from being able to drink their wine. It's also a matter of wanting to find a solution. I can find a solution for this person. You might tell me something might happen. I'm not going to worry about that. Okay. So that was our first attempt to try to find where Rabbi Yehuda holds ein breira, that the Gemara so simply says Rabbi Yehuda holds ein breira. Well, it's not from here, because here the reason seems to be something else. Ela miditane ayo. Must be from this braita that Ayo brought. Titane Ayo. Ayo is a person. He brought this braita. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Ein Adam matne al shnei dvarim ke'echad. You can't condition your Eruv. Okay, let's go back to laws of Eruv. For those who didn't learn Eruv, there's what's called an Eruvin. Whoever didn't learn Eruvin, Masechet Eruvin. So there's something called an Eruv Tchumim, which is on Shabbat, you're not allowed to walk 2,000 cubits outside your city. Okay, there's some details. It's a little bit more, but let's just stick with the basics. Can't walk 2,000 cubits outside your city. But if you put an Eruv 2,000 cubits from your city, and you say, which means basically you put food down, and the food has to be there when Shabbat starts, even if you're not there when Shabbat starts, you can do what's called liknot shvita. You're basically acquiring a space of living space in that space, wherever you did it. You now get 2,000 cubits from that space. So you're basically saying, even though I'm sleeping in my house tonight on Friday night, I want to consider that my house, so that in the morning I can walk 2,000 cubits from there. So now they say, you can't put up an Eruv in two different places and make a condition that maybe one or the other. But in what way? So there's one way you could do it, and one way you can't do it. You can put up an Eruv under condition. You can put up two Eruvs and say the following. Ela im ba chacham lemizrach, eruvo lemizrach, lema'arav, eruvo lema'arav. Aval lekan u lekan lo. I can put up two Eruvs, one in the east and one in the west, and say, listen, tomorrow I want to go to this drasha that this rabbi is going to give. I know he's coming from somewhere, but I don't know from which direction. So I'm going to put one up in the east and one up in the west. If he comes from the east, and I'm going to need to walk 2,000 cubits outside my city to get to this rabbi's drasha, so it's going to be, my Eruv is going to be to the east. If he comes from the west, my Eruv is going to be to the west. But I can't say lekan u lekan, that I want to decide tomorrow, lekan u lekan means that if there's, let's say, one rabbi coming from the east and one rabbi coming from the west, and I want to decide in the morning which one I want to go here, I can't do it in that way. I can't say, I'll decide in the morning which way I'm going. So to which the Gemara questions, Vehevinamba, Maishna lekanu lekantilo, de'en brera, lemizrach u lema'arav, not the ein brera. I don't understand the difference between the two cases, the Gemara asks, because either which way, it's brera. It's basically saying that when Shabbat morning comes and I find out which direction, either in the first case, it's which direction the rabbi came from or is coming from, where he is in the morning, or if I find out in the morning, I make a decision in the morning, which one I want to go here, either which way, it's retroactive designation. So either it should work or it shouldn't work. Why in the first case does it work? And in the second case, it doesn't work. So what's the difference between the two cases? So now, again, we would say what the Gemara is basically saying is, if you say that lakan or lakan doesn't work, that I want to decide in the morning, that proves that there's no breira, because I can't decide now on Shabbat morning what I wanted my Eruv to be yesterday, right? I wanted my Eruv, when the Eruv happened, right, when I put it down, I put one in the east and one in the west, and I didn't know which one I was planning to use. So in the morning, when I decide, that then it can be effective, but it doesn't work clearly because ain breira. But if there's ain breira, then the first case shouldn't have worked either, because it's the same thing. If I find out in the morning which direction he came from, so then I'll decide. It's again the same thing, retroactive determination. So what does the Gemara answer? Amar Rabbi Yochanan, they bring Rabbi Yochanan's answer. Kishek far b'chacham. These are two different cases. In case number one, the Mizrach u'Ma'arav, what happened was the Chacham already came either to the east or to the west, but because there was poor communication, right? It took time till he would get word about it. He only found out on Shabbat, but before Shabbat started, the Chacham already either came either to the east or to the west. So when Shabbat started, it was already determined where the Eruv, which Eruv he was going to use. It's just he didn't know about it. It's very fascinating, this idea that I personally, let's say it's me, I don't know where I'm going in the morning. I don't know which Eruv, when Shabbat starts, was the one I was going to use. But it was already known to the world, someone knew which Eruv, and the facts on the ground were he had already come from one direction. And therefore, when Shabbat started, it was clear which Eruv it was. It's just I didn't know, right? It's like the tree falls in the forest, okay? Now, there nobody, right? Here, somebody knew at least, or at least it was known that there was some knowledge in the world about where the Chacham had come to. And therefore, it was determined, even if nobody knew, it was known which Eruv was going to be the Eruv. But if it's determined by my own thinking, meaning my decision making, I'm going to decide in the morning, right? How many of us do this? We push off the decision till the last minute, right? As long as I can still decide in the morning, so I'll decide in the morning which shiur I want to go to. Would I rather hear that person speak? Or would I rather hear that person speak? I don't know. I'll decide. I'll see what I'm in the mood for in the morning. If you do that, then when Shabbat started, it clearly wasn't determined because there were two different chachamim. They were each in their place, but my Eruv wasn't dependent on them. It was dependent on my decision. And therefore, it doesn't work. So in the end, what have we proven here? According to the way we finally understand this, it is a law of breira, and it's because Rabbi Yehuda holds, remember, this is all quoted in the name of Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda said, you can't do this. Okay. And why does it say you can't do that? Because ain breira. The case where it works, it's just not a breira case. But the second case is a case of breira, and Rabbi Yehuda holds ain breira, and there's our proof. Now, where does this get us to? So the whole idea here was that when it came to the shofarot, the issue was with the shofarot, we said the reason for the shofarot is because we don't rely on the Kohen. We don't rely on him reading. In the end, we rejected that, right? We tried to connect that to our Mishnah. That's the reason in our Mishnah. In the end, we say the case of the shofarot has nothing to do with this. It's all about the chatat, that if the owner dies, we're going to be stuck. And we can't do breira because we're talking about Rabbi Yehuda, and Rabbi Yehuda says ain breira. And that's why Rabbi Yehuda thinks in Shkalim that you can't do this. You can't have one for obligations and one for voluntary. It's really the issue is you just can't have obligatory offerings. It's not because you can't have one for each because you'll confuse them. It's because we can't have any kind of obligatory offerings in these shofarot, because if someone puts the money and they were to die, we'd have no resolution because he doesn't hold by breira. And that would be the only solution, how to solve that problem. And that's his reason there. So now they say, if that's the case, right, we had two choices. Either the issue by shofarot was we can't rely on people reading the directions and what it says, the labels, or it's this issue of the chatat shemetu ba'aleh. In the end, we determined that's the issue and not the writing, which means now that we've resolved that Rabbi Yehuda holds ain breira, haktiva itle, but he does hold that you can rely on people reading the labels. So therefore, so now we're back to square one. Why did he hold there's only one pedestal? Theoretically, you could have put two pedestals and written on one seir and one par, and you would have no confusion. So the answer, very interesting answer, Mishum chusha de kohen gadol lavadati. This is a unique halacha on Yom Kippur as regards the kohen gadol. Normally, you can rely on people reading, but in this case, the kohen gadol is weak on that day. Now, you can explain this weak in a few different ways. Weak either because he hasn't eaten and he's working very hard and he didn't sleep all night. But in addition, you could say it's not just weakness. It's a little bit distracted. He's got a lot on his mind and a lot to think about and a lot of details. And he's got to keep them all straight. And it might lead to some confusion that he might not pay attention to the par and the seer, right? One could claim the opposite. What do you mean? It's Yom Kippur. It's the Kohen Gadol. But he's super careful, right? One day a year, we can expect you're going to be super careful. On the other hand, they're saying, but you have to keep in mind, first of all, if you remember, Bayit Sheni, the end of Bayit Sheni, Second Temple period, the Kohanim Gedolim were not the most reliable of people. So it could be also that's explaining it. And they're busy with a lot of things and they're weak and tired. And therefore, even though normally on a normal day, we can rely on the people who bring the money, paying attention to where they're putting their money, and the people, Kohanim, who are accepting the money, paying attention to what it says. And that's not the issue. It's a whole separate issue there. But the issue is that it's a matter of the Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippur specifically being overwhelmed, tired, and won't pay attention. And that's why we make it so that there's no room for error, and we have one pedestal, according to Rabbi Yehuda. So now they say, and how do we know this is the case? Well, we'll further prove it. Even if it weren't words, and if that weren't the issue, and let's say we wrote it, there's other reasons why you would assume that even if we wrote, there's other reason, or we didn't write, let's say. There's other, right? It really is we didn't write. Even if we didn't write, still there would be other differences between them that we could assume the Kohen Gadol would be able to note the difference between the par and the seer. For example, Hai Nafesh v'Hai Zuta. There's a lot of blood from the par, and there's very little blood from the seer, or much less than the par. And therefore, you would say he's not going to mix between the par and the seir because there's so much more by the par than there is by the seir. Why? Because the par is a large animal. There's a lot more blood in a large animal and a lot less blood in a smaller animal. Maybe you might say, but maybe you don't have to use all the blood of the par, in which case maybe it'll be the same amount as this year. You can only take some of it. Well, we already learned this. We saw this a few days ago. That when you slaughter the animal, you have to take all the blood, okay? Not the damatamtzi, the blood that squeezes out after, but all the blood that spurts out from the slaughtering, that all has to be used. How do we learn this? From a pasuk, and don't confuse this verse. This isn't the par of Yom Kippur. This is a different par, but it teaches you about the bloods in general. It's about the par Kohen HaMashiach, which is if a Kohen Gadol makes a mistake in teaching, he has to bring his own, and all the details, we'll get into those later, but he has to bring a par, Kohen HaMashiach, it's called. And there the verse says, it's in Vayikra chapter 4, Ve'et kol dama par yishbocha yesod mizbech. And all the blood of the par. Why does it say all the blood of the par? Because it means you have to take all the blood. And there you pour it at the base of the altar. Obviously, you do something different with that than you do with this. But the point is you have to accept all the blood. So clearly, there's going to be a difference not only in if you write par and seir on the pedestals, but even the way it looks is different because the par is a much bigger, it's a bowl much fuller of blood than the seir. And additionally, even if you would say, maybe you'll claim, well, it's true there's more blood, but remember what we learned. If some of the blood spills, you can still use the blood that's left. So you might say, well, you can't necessarily rely on the fact that he's going to pay attention. One has a lot more and one has a lot less because maybe some of the blood of the par spilled and he doesn't have the whole thing, but still they look different. Hai chivar v'hai sumak. The blood, this one's white and this one's red. It obviously doesn't mean white, but the point is the seir's blood, the goat's blood is much lighter than the blood of the par. How do we know this? We learned this already. Remember the different shades of gold? And we said one gold is called zahav parvayim, and this is dam haparim. It looks like the blood. It's red like the blood of the bulls. The bull's blood was obviously much redder, and therefore you can also tell by the color. So the fact that we have all these different ways you could tell, and yet we don't rely on that, Rabbi Yehuda doesn't think that we can rely on the Kohen noticing all these differences, is a clear proof Ela mishum chosha de kohen gadol lavadate. We're assuming he's not going to be paying attention to all these details. And therefore, hachanami mishum chosha de kohen gadol lavadate. We're going to say the same thing here, that we can't assume. That's why we don't have one. We only have one pedestal, so that what's he going to do? Remember, he's going to, when he goes to put down the blood, he's going to pick up the new blood and then put down the other blood, right? So let's say he was dealing with the par. So he puts down the blood of the, first he picks up the blood of the seir into one hand, puts down the dam of the par in the other. That's the only way he won't confuse them. If he puts, according to the other reading, Tanakama, first he'll put down the bull's blood and only after he'll pick up the goat blood. And we're not worried he's going to confuse them. But according to Rabbi Yehuda, we're worried he's going to confuse them, despite the fact that there's a difference in color, despite the fact that there's a difference in size, and despite the fact that theoretically we could put a sign on. We're clearly concerned that on this day, the Kohen Gadol is going to confuse things. So therefore, that's our proof. Now we're going to have an example of someone who is davening on Yom Kippur. Okay, it's a good proof in front of Rava. Here's evidence that already in the time of Rava, fourth generation Tanaim, okay, Amoraim, sorry, the time of the Gemara, potentially even earlier, they already had davening similar to ours in the sense that they would they would go through what the Kohen Gadol did on Yom Kippur in the Beit HaMikdash in the time when there was a temple, right? Nowadays, for Ashkenazim, it's Amitzkoach, for Sfaradim, it's Atakonanta, and there's these different versions, but each of them describe what Avodah the Kohen Gadol did. And what's really fascinating about it, and I hope you'll enjoy this year when you go to Shul on Yom Kippur, paying attention to details of which side of the machloket in all sorts of cases that we learned does the tefillah side by. We saw some examples of this earlier. So now here was someone, he was davening, nachit means he yarad, means he was, it's called yored lefnei ateva, he was the chazan before Rava, Amal, and when he was describing this part of the service, he said, Yatsa v'hinicho al kan sheni shebayechal. So he puts the blood down on the second pedestal, meaning the damasiyah. Natal damapal v'hiniach damasiyah. So he puts down the he picks up the damapar. Sorry, it's obviously now he's talking about the opposite. When he goes to put down the damasiyah and now go to get the damapal, so he puts down first he picks up the bull's blood and then he puts down the seir's blood. Sorry, I keep messing up the words. Start again. Natal damapar, he picks up the damapal and only then does he put down the damasir. So there's a lot of confusion here. Why? Because Amarle, Chadik Rabbanan, Chadik Rabbi Yehuda. First you said there were two. If there were two pedestals, what's supposed to happen? He's supposed to first put down the dam seir. Sorry, I really said it wrong. I don't know why I got so confused Sunday morning. What he was trying to do here was to take the dam hapal. Actually, I did say this right. Now I'm just getting more confused. He wanted to get the dam hapal, right? The bull's blood. He finished now with the seir and he's moving back to the bull. So he wanted to get that blood. Now, if you're Tanakama, what do? First, you put down the dam seir and then you pick up the dam hapal. And what did he do? He did the exact opposite, which sounds like Rabbi Yehuda. According to Rabbi Yehuda, first you have to pick up, right, the new blood, have both in your hand, and then put down the other blood because you only have one pedestal. You can't possibly put them both down at the same time. So he says, your tefillah is all mixed up because you said both like the rabbis and like Rabbi Yehuda. So and he tells him, this is what you should say. You should switch your order and say, Hiniach damasir v'natal damapal. You should say, first switch your order. First, you put down the damasir, and then he picked up the damapal. So basically, he said, your tefillah doesn't make sense because I don't care if you side by one or the other, but be consistent in what you're saying. You weren't consistent, so basically, we should say it all like the rabbis. There were two, and then you continue and say, first put down the blood, and then pick up the other blood. Last part for today. We're back to the Mishnah now. We described the sprinklings of the blood inside the Kodesh Kodeshim. Now we're going to go to the ones that are done. Remember, he goes out of the Kodesh Kodeshim, and he goes, right, first he went out after he did the Torah, the incense offering. He went out to get the bloods. Then, right, he goes in with one blood, goes in with the other blood, goes out. Then he now is standing in the Heichal. There's two stands there, or one stand, depending on how you read it. And now he's about to do the sprinklings of the blood inside the sanctuary, not inside the Kodesh Kodeshim. And he does them on the parochet, facing the parochet, right in the spot opposite where the Aron Kodesh is inside. But he doesn't see that when he's doing this. And he sprinkles toward the parochet. Keneged Aron mi bachutz. That's opposite where the ark was inside. Tanu, right? It says mi bachutz, meaning he's standing outside where the Aron is inside. Tanu Rabbanit. V'chein ya'aseh la'ol moed. So here's a verse in Vayikra Tetzayin. It says, V'chiper ala kodesh mitumot b'nei Yisrael u'mipeshehem. Right? He atones for the sins by sprinkling the blood. L'chol chatatam, for all their sins. And now we're going to darshan the last half of this pasuk, 2 parts of the last half. V'chein ya'aseh la'ol moed. Hashochein otam itam b'toch tumatam. Likewise, he will do for in Oel Moed, right? Meaning he'll sprinkle the blood in the same way in Oel Moed, which is the sanctuary. Hashocheni tam b'toch tumatam, that's God who dwells among them within their impurity. So we'll get to that part in a minute. First, the first part. Ma tamud lamar. You don't have to say v'chein yaseh la'ol moed. You could just say v'chein b'oel moed or something like that. And likewise in Oel Moed. Why does it say yaseh? Keshem shemazeh lefanai v'lifnim kach mazeh behechal. The Torah doesn't tell you how many sprinklings you're supposed to do in the Hechal and what the order is. So the point is, we're going to say, just like it was done in the Kodesh Kodeshim, the Ya'aseh comes to say it's going to be done in the exact same manner outside. So, just like inside, he would do 1 above and 7 below of the bull. That's what he's going to do also outside. And just like he did on the inside, 1 up, 7 down, likewise with the Damasir is going to do the same on the outside, okay, in the sanctuary. This drasha is going to lead us to a whole discussion between Amin and Rabbi Chanina on tomorrow's daf. But first, we're going to just darshan it. Afilu b'sha'at shehem tmeim shchina imahem. Hashocheni tam b'toch tumatam is a real Yom Kippur message, which is that God dwells among us even when we're impure. And it doesn't just mean impurity like you touched a sheretz or you were impure to a dead body, but impurity often means you're full of sin. Even when we're full of sin, God still dwells among us. And that's a big concept of Yom Kippur in general, that there's always room for atonement. God will always accept us, even if we're impure, even if we've done bad things. There's always room for God to dwell among us. No matter what, he doesn't just leave us. And that's a nice idea to end off on today's daf. And we'll continue with this on tomorrow's daf. So Shavua Tov, everyone.